The transatlantic slave trade was a dark chapter in human history, one that left an indelible mark on the world. It began in the 15th century, a time when European nations were driven by the desire for new territories and wealth. European powers were exploring new lands and established colonies in the Americas, seeking to exploit the resources and potential of these new territories. These colonies needed labor to cultivate crops and build infrastructure, and so European powers turned to Africa, where they saw an opportunity to fulfill their labor demands.
They began trading goods such as guns, textiles, and alcohol for enslaved Africans, creating a brutal and inhumane system of exchange. This trade grew over centuries and involved millions of Africans who were forcibly taken from their homes and communities. These Africans were taken from their homes, often through violent raids and kidnappings, and forced into slavery in the Americas, enduring horrific conditions during the Middle Passage. This trade had a devastating impact on Africa, leading to the loss of countless lives, the disruption of societies, and the destabilization of entire regions. It lasted for over 400 years, leaving a legacy of trauma and suffering.
The transatlantic slave trade was driven by greed and fueled by racism, as European powers sought to maximize their profits at the expense of African lives. It treated human beings as commodities, stripping them of their dignity and humanity, and subjecting them to unimaginable suffering. The trade had a profound impact on the Americas, shaping their societies, economies, and cultures in ways that are still felt today. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is a reminder of the capacity for human cruelty and the enduring struggle for justice and equality.
The Middle Passage was the harrowing journey of enslaved Africans across the vast and treacherous Atlantic Ocean. This journey was a central part of the transatlantic slave trade, a dark and brutal chapter in human history. Africans were forcibly taken from their homeland, torn from their families, and transported from Africa to the Americas under inhumane conditions. The Middle Passage was a horrific experience marked by unimaginable suffering and cruelty. Enslaved Africans were subjected to brutal treatment from the moment they were captured.
Millions of Africans were crammed onto ships, packed tightly into the ship's hold with barely any room to move or breathe. These ships were overcrowded and unsanitary, with deplorable conditions that led to the spread of disease and infection. Enslaved Africans were chained together, often in painful positions, and denied basic human needs such as adequate food, water, and sanitation. They suffered from disease, starvation, and abuse at the hands of their captors, enduring physical and psychological torment. Many died during the journey, their bodies callously thrown overboard into the ocean, a testament to the disregard for human life.
The Middle Passage was a testament to human cruelty, a stark reminder of the capacity for inhumanity. It stands as a symbol of the dehumanization of enslaved Africans, who were treated as mere commodities rather than human beings. The ships were designed for profit, maximizing the number of enslaved people transported, with complete disregard for their well-being or dignity. The conditions on these ships were deplorable, with enslaved Africans enduring unimaginable hardships and suffering. The Middle Passage remains a haunting reminder of this dark chapter in history, a period marked by profound suffering and loss. It is a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of those who endured it. The transatlantic slave trade was driven by economics. European powers established colonies in the Americas, and these colonies needed labor. They turned to enslaved Africans to work on plantations.
These plantations produced crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These crops were in high demand in Europe and brought great profits to European slave traders and plantation owners. The slave trade became a lucrative business. It enriched European nations and fueled the growth of their economies.
The economies of many European cities were built on the slave trade. They thrived on the profits generated by enslaved labor. The transatlantic slave trade had a profound impact on the Americas. It transformed colonial societies. Enslaved Africans made up a significant portion of the population in many colonies. Their labor was essential to the economies of these colonies.
However, they were denied basic human rights and subjected to brutal treatment. The slave trade led to the development of a racial hierarchy. Europeans were at the top of this hierarchy, and Africans were at the bottom. This hierarchy justified the enslavement of Africans and had a lasting impact on race relations in the Americas. Section 5. Resistance, the fight for freedom.
Enslaved Africans resisted their enslavement from the very beginning. Their resistance took many forms. Some resisted passively. They slowed down their work. They broke tools.
Others resisted more actively. They ran away. They formed rebellions. These acts of resistance were a testament to the human spirit. They showed that enslaved Africans never gave up hope for freedom. They were determined to fight for their rights. These acts of resistance played a crucial role in the eventual abolition of slavery. Section 6. Abolition, a long and difficult struggle.
The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was a long and difficult process, marked by numerous challenges and setbacks. It was driven by a variety of factors, each playing a crucial role in the eventual success of the movement. These factors included moral outrage, economic changes, and political pressure. The moral arguments were particularly powerful, as they appealed to the conscience of the public.
Abolitionists campaigned tirelessly against slavery, organizing rallies, writing pamphlets, and speaking out in public forums. They highlighted the horrors of the slave trade, bringing to light the inhumane conditions endured by enslaved people during the Middle Passage. They argued that slavery was a moral abomination. They demanded its abolition, emphasizing that it was a stain on humanity and a violation of basic human rights.
Their efforts eventually led to the abolition of the slave trade in most European countries and the Americas by the 19th century. This was a monumental achievement, but it was only the beginning. However, the fight against slavery did not end there. Even after the abolition of the slave trade, slavery itself persisted in many regions. Slavery itself continued in many parts of the Americas for decades after the abolition of the slave trade. The struggle for complete emancipation and equality was far from over, requiring continued advocacy and resistance.
Section 7. Legacies of the trade, racism and inequality.
The transatlantic slave trade had a lasting legacy on the world. It left an indelible mark on the Americas. It continues to shape societies today. One of the most significant legacies of the slave trade is racism.
The slave trade created a racial hierarchy. This hierarchy placed Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom. This hierarchy justified the enslavement of Africans. It has continued to fuel racism and discrimination long after the abolition of slavery. Section 8. Memory and Memorialization. Remembering and memorializing the transatlantic slave trade is crucial. It is a reminder of the horrors of this dark chapter.
It honors the millions of Africans who suffered and died. It acknowledges the lasting impact of the slave trade on the world.
Memory and memorialization take many forms. Memorials and museums have been built, educational programs have been established.
These efforts are essential. They ensure that the lessons of the slave trade are not forgotten. They help to combat racism and discrimination.
Section 9. The transatlantic slave trade and the modern world. The transatlantic slave trade may seem like a distant event. However, its legacy is still felt today.
The slave trade had a profound impact on global economics. It shaped international relations. It continues to influence cultural attitudes.
The wealth generated by the slave trade helped to fuel the Industrial Revolution. This revolution transformed Europe and North America. It widened the gap between the West and the rest of the world.
This gap persists today. It is evident in global economic inequality.
Section 10. Understanding the past, shaping the future. Understanding the transatlantic slave trade is essential. It helps us understand the world today.
It teaches us about the dangers of greed, racism, and the abuse of power. It reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit.
We must learn from the past. We must work to create a more just and equitable world.
We must challenge racism, discrimination, and inequality. We must honor the memory of those who suffered. We must ensure that such atrocities never happen again.
Section 11. Conclusion. A legacy of resilience and resistance. The transatlantic slave trade was a horrific chapter in human history. It was a story of human cruelty, greed, and exploitation.
However, it was also a story of resilience, resistance, and the fight for freedom. Enslaved Africans resisted their enslavement from the very beginning.
Their resistance played a crucial role in the eventual abolition of slavery. The legacy of the slave trade is complex and multifaceted.
It is a legacy of pain and suffering. It is also a legacy of strength, courage, and the enduring human spirit. We must never forget the lessons of the transatlantic slave trade.